Comment below, do you think experience beats youth? And don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories. He thought he had already won, until silence changed everything. In the heart of Las Vegas, where neon lights cast shadows over broken dreams and shattered egos, the most anticipated confrontation in combat sports history was about to unfold. Not in an octagon, not in a ring, but in a place where legends are born and pretenders are exposed. This isn't just a story about two fighters. This is about what happens when raw arrogance collides head-on with decades of earned wisdom. What you're about to witness will make you question everything you think you know about strength, respect, and what it truly means to be a champion. The Staples Center buzzed with an electricity that seemed to vibrate through the concrete foundations and into the bones of every person present. 25,000 people packed into every available seat, their voices creating a symphony of anticipation that could be felt in your chest like the bass line of a song played too loud. But this wasn't just any crowd. This was a gathering of the faithful, those who believed in something bigger than themselves, those who had come seeking more than entertainment. In the VIP section, celebrities leaned forward in their seats, phones already recording, their instincts telling them they were about to witness something that would be replayed and analyzed for years to come. The air itself seemed thick with expectation, charged with the kind of energy that precedes either triumph or disaster, as if the very atmosphere knew something extraordinary was coming. The pre-event festivities had been building for hours. Vendors hawked merchandise featuring Kane's intimidating image. Children wore replica championship belts around their waists, and analysts on the big screens dissected every aspect of modern combat sports with the intensity of scholars studying ancient texts. But underneath all the pageantry, there was an undercurrent of something deeper, something that suggested tonight would be different from every other night in the building's storied history. Veterans in the crowd, men and women who had seen decades of fights, shifted in their seats with a restless energy they couldn't quite explain. This felt like more than sport. It felt like a reckoning. Marcus, the Destroyer. Kane stood at the center of it all, his perfectly sculpted physique glistening under the arena lights like a bronze statue brought to life. At 28 years old, he was the undisputed UFC heavyweight champion, undefeated in 37 professional fights that had redefined what dominance looked like in modern combat sports. His record wasn't just impressive, it was devastating, almost supernatural in its completeness. 34 knockouts, 3 submissions, never even knocked down, never even appearing to be in serious trouble. The golden championship belt around his waist caught the light like a beacon of his superiority, each gem and engraving telling the story of another opponent who had dared to challenge him and had been found wanting. Kane's entourage surrounded him like disciples worshipping their god, hanging on his every word, laughing at his every joke, feeding the monster of his ego with constant validation and unwavering loyalty. His nutritionist, his strength coach, his massage therapist, his social media manager, each one had built their career on his success. Each one had a vested interest in maintaining the mythology that surrounded him. They formed a human buffer between Kane and reality, ensuring that every interaction reinforced his belief in his own invincibility, his own superiority, his own right to treat the rest of the world as subjects in his kingdom. The champion's personal history was the stuff of modern American mythology. Born in the projects of Southside Chicago, raised by a single mother who worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table, Marcus had discovered fighting not as a sport, but as survival. The neighborhood he grew up in didn't produce athletes, it produced survivors, and the difference between the two had shaped every aspect of his worldview. By age 12, he was already known as the kid you didn't mess with. By 16, he was making money in underground fight clubs, earning more in a single night than his mother made in a month. By 20, he had turned professional, and begun his relentless march toward the championship that now seemed permanently attached to his identity. But somewhere along the way, the survival instinct that had saved him as a child had twisted into something darker. The need to never show weakness had evolved into a compulsion to expose weakness in others. The determination to never be victimized again had transformed into a drive to victimize before being victimized. Marcus Kane had become everything he had once feared, but the applause of crowds and the validation of victory had made it impossible for him to see the transformation. In his mind, he wasn't a bully. He was justice. He wasn't cruel. He was honest. He wasn't destroying people. He was revealing their true nature. Kane's voice boomed through the arena as he grabbed the microphone from a nearby reporter, his movements fluid and predatory like a big cat claiming territory. "You see this?" He held up his championship belt, the gold gleaming like a trophy of conquest, the leather worn smooth by countless photo shoots and public appearances. "This represents something you old-timers could never understand. This is evolution. This is what peak human performance looks like in the 21st century. I don't just beat my opponents. I demolish them. I embarrass them. I send them into retirement with their tails between their legs and their dreams scattered across the canvas like broken glass." The crowd's reaction was immediate and visceral, a mix of cheers and boos that seemed to split along generational lines. His fans, mostly younger people who had grown up in an era of instant gratification and social media warfare, roared their approval at his braggadocio. They saw in Kane a reflection of their own frustrations, with a world that seemed to reward politeness over power, humility over aggression. To them, he wasn't just a fighter. He was a symbol of what it meant to take what you wanted instead of waiting for someone to give it to you. But others in the crowd shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing something troubling in Kane's words and demeanor. These were people who remembered a different kind of champion, athletes who had carried themselves with dignity and respect, even in victory. They saw in Kane's arrogance not strength, but insecurity, not confidence, but compensation for something missing in his character. The divide in the crowd was palpable, creating an atmosphere of tension that went far beyond the usual excitement of a sporting event. Kane fed off the energy like a predator, sensing weakness in a herd. The mixed reaction only seemed to fuel his need to prove his point, to demonstrate his superiority not just through physical dominance, but through psychological warfare. He had learned early in his career that breaking an opponent's spirit was often more effective than breaking their body, and he had refined this skill until it had become his signature move outside the octagon, as well as inside it. His manager, Vinny Torino, a slick-haired man in an expensive Italian suit that probably cost more than most people's cars, whispered something in Kane's ear. Vinny had been in the fight game for 30 years, managing everyone from journeyman boxers to world champions, but he had never had a meal ticket like Marcus Kane. The champion wasn't just an athlete. He was a brand, a lifestyle, a carefully crafted persona that generated millions of dollars in revenue across multiple platforms. Pay-per-view buys, merchandise sales, endorsement deals, social media partnerships. Kane was a one-man entertainment empire, and Vinny was the puppet master pulling the strings. Kane's eyes lit up with malicious delight at whatever Vinny had whispered to him. "You know what?" he announced, his voice carrying that particular tone of someone who was about to cross a line they knew they shouldn't cross, but couldn't resist crossing anyway. "I heard there's some washed-up old fossil here tonight. Some relic from the Stone Age of boxing who thinks he still matters in a world that has completely passed him by. Where is he? Where's this so-called legend hiding among the real people who understand what modern combat sports are all about?" His voice dripped with contempt as he scanned the crowd, his predatory gaze searching for his target like a hunter looking for prey. The arena fell into an uncomfortable hush, the kind of silence that precedes either a revelation or a disaster. The kind of moment when everyone present realizes they are about to witness something that will be remembered long after the evening ends. Even Kane's most devoted supporters seemed to sense that their hero was venturing into territory that might be dangerous, not physically, but morally, ethically, spiritually. The silence stretched out like a taut wire, threatening to snap at any moment. Security personnel throughout the building tensed, their training telling them to prepare for anything. Camera operators adjusted their positions, instinctively understanding that they were about to capture something significant. Social media influencers in attendance began live streaming, their followers multiplying by the thousands as word spread that something extraordinary was happening at the Staples Center. Then from the shadows near the back entrance, a figure emerged that seemed to shift the very fabric of reality in the building. At first glance, he seemed almost insignificant compared to the spectacle surrounding Kane, just another aging face in a crowd of thousands. But there was something in the way he moved, something in his bearing that made the entire arena take notice without quite understanding why. 68-year-old Rocky Balboa moved with the measured pace of someone who had nothing to prove but everything to protect. Every step deliberate and purposeful, like a man walking toward his destiny. Rocky's appearance was a study in contrasts to everything that Kane represented. Where the champion wore designer clothes that screamed wealth and status, Rocky dressed in a simple dark suit that had probably been purchased off the rack at a department store. Where Kane's body was sculpted and perfect, Rocky's showed the wear and tear of decades of honest labor and honest fighting. His grey hair was combed neatly, but without the artificial perfection of a media-trained celebrity. His hands, weathered and scarred from decades of battle, told stories that no amount of marketing could fabricate. But there was something in Rocky's walk, something in the way he carried himself, that transcended physical appearance and touched something deeper in everyone who saw him. This wasn't the shuffle of an old man trying to recapture past glory. This was the deliberate stride of someone who had faced down giants and lived to tell the tale. Someone who had been tested in ways that most people couldn't even imagine, and had emerged not unscathed, but unbroken. His presence seemed to fill the space in a way that had nothing to do with volume or showmanship and everything to do with authenticity. Rocky's presence seemed to shift the very energy of the building in ways that defied rational explanation. Conversations died mid-sentence as people found themselves inexplicably drawn to watch this unassuming figure make his way through the crowd. Even Kane's most loyal supporters found themselves strangely quiet, as if some part of them recognized that they were in the presence of something rare and valuable, something that couldn't be manufactured or marketed or sold. The former heavyweight champion of the world didn't announce himself with fanfare or bravado or carefully orchestrated entrance music. He simply existed, and somehow that existence filled the space more completely than all of Kane's showboating combined. The stories that followed Rocky Balboa were the stuff of legend, though he had never been one to tell them himself. The small-time fighter from Philadelphia who had gotten a shot at the heavyweight championship and had turned it into one of the greatest underdog stories in sports history. The man who had faced Apollo Creed, Clubber Lang, Ivan Drago, Tommy Gunn, each fight a chapter in a story that had become part of American mythology. But more than the fights, more than the championships, more than the fame, Rocky represented something that seemed increasingly rare in modern sports. The idea that how you fought mattered more than whether you won. His hands, resting calmly at his sides, told stories that would take hours to relate properly. Scars from training sessions that had pushed him beyond his limits, calluses from thousands of hours hitting heavy bags and speed bags, lines etched by years of victories and defeats that had taught him the difference between being tough and being strong, between being fearless and being brave, between being a fighter and being a warrior. These weren't the manicured hands of a celebrity athlete. They were the working hands of someone who had earned every victory through blood and sweat and determination. His eyes, still sharp despite his years, took in everything with the patience of someone who had seen it all before and understood that very little in life was truly new, that most of what appeared to be innovation was really just variation on eternal themes. He had seen young fighters full of rage and older fighters full of wisdom, champions who carried themselves with dignity and champions who let success poison their souls, crowds that cheered for the right reasons and crowds that cheered for the wrong ones. Nothing that was happening tonight surprised him, but that didn't mean it didn't concern him. Kane spotted Rocky immediately, his predatory instincts homing in on what he perceived as weakness, like a shark detecting blood in the water. But what Kane saw as vulnerability, others in the crowd began to recognize as something entirely different. The calm confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove to anyone, least of all to himself. A cruel smile spread across Kane's face as he pointed directly at Rocky, the gesture theatrical and calculated for maximum humiliation. There he is. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you a living fossil, the great Rocky Balboa, if you can believe it. The way Kane pronounced Rocky's name was like a verbal slap, each syllable dripping with condescension and mock reverence. Tell me, old man, what's it like being a relic? What's it like knowing that everything you accomplished means absolutely nothing in today's world? What's it like walking around knowing that you're nothing but a name on old posters, a story that grandparents tell their grandkids about the good old days that never really existed in the first place? The insults came fast and brutal, each one designed to humiliate and destroy, each one crafted with the precision of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of psychological warfare. Kane spoke about Rocky's age, painting him as a pathetic old man, clinging to past glories while the world moved on without him. He talked about Rocky's outdated fighting style, suggesting that everything the older man had accomplished would be meaningless against modern training methods and contemporary athletes. He painted a picture of irrelevance so complete and devastating that it should have reduced his target to tears or rage or some combination of both. "You're nothing but a footnote in history," Kane continued, his voice rising with each insult. "A cautionary tale about what happens when people don't know when to step aside and let their betters take over. Face it, Rocky. Your time is over, and it's been over for decades. You're like a black and white movie in a world of high-definition reality. You're like a horse and buggy trying to race against a Ferrari. You're not just obsolete, you're embarrassing." Rocky stood there and absorbed every word without flinching, his expression remaining neutral, almost serene, as if Kane's venom was nothing more than rain falling on stone, as if the younger man's rage was just wind that would eventually blow itself out without causing any real damage. His stillness wasn't the frozen paralysis of someone who had been shocked into inaction. It was the deliberate calm of someone who understood that responding to every provocation only gave it power, that sometimes the strongest response was no response at all. This only seemed to infuriate Kane more. The champion had built his reputation on breaking people, on finding their weak spots and attacking them until his opponents crumbled under the psychological pressure. He expected anger, expected the old man to lose his composure and prove Kane's point about irrelevance and weakness. Instead, he was met with a calm that was somehow more unsettling than any rage could have been, a peace that suggested Rocky existed on a different plane entirely from the petty cruelties that Kane dealt in. The crowd began to shift uncomfortably as Kane's tirade continued. What had started as entertainment was becoming something darker, something that made people question not just what they were witnessing, but what they were complicit in by their presence. Some of Kane's own supporters began to look away, suddenly finding their phones or their drinks more interesting than the spectacle before them, as if some part of them recognized that they were watching something that diminished everyone involved, including themselves. Others leaned forward, sensing that they were witnessing something significant, though they couldn't quite put their finger on what it was. There was a quality to Rocky's stillness that seemed to fill the enormous arena, a presence that suggested this moment was about much more than one aging fighter being insulted by a younger champion. This felt like a test, though it wasn't clear who was being tested or what the stakes were or what would constitute passing or failing. Kane's frustration mounted with each passing second of Rocky's silence, his need for a reaction becoming more desperate and more obvious. "What's wrong, Grandpa? Cat got your tongue? Or maybe you're just too senile to understand what's happening here?" He stepped closer to the edge of the platform where he stood, his voice becoming more aggressive, more desperate, like a schoolyard bully who had discovered that his usual tactics weren't working and was escalating in hopes of finally getting the response he craved. "I'm talking to you, you worthless has-been." Kane's voice cracked slightly, betraying the insecurity that lived underneath all his bluster and bravado. "The least you could do is acknowledge your betters when they're speaking to you. The least you could do is show some respect for someone who actually matters in this world." But what Kane didn't know, what none of them knew except perhaps Rocky himself, was that the man standing calmly in the crowd had faced monsters before, not just in the ring, but in life itself. Rocky Balboa had stood toe-to-toe with men who wanted to destroy not just his body but his spirit, who had tried to break him down and rebuild him in their own image. He had been knocked down more times than most people could count, had tasted his own blood on canvas that had witnessed the birth and death of thousands of dreams, had felt the sting of defeat and the hollow victory of success that came at too high a price. Yet here he stood, not because he was unbreakable, everyone breaks eventually, but because he had learned the most important lesson of all, that true strength doesn't announce itself with threats and insults, that real power doesn't need to diminish others to prove itself, that genuine confidence doesn't require the validation of crowds or the destruction of enemies. Rocky had learned these lessons the hard way, through years of making mistakes and paying for them, through relationships damaged by pride and opportunities lost to stubbornness, and moments of grace that had taught him the difference between being right and being righteous. The arena held its collective breath as Rocky finally began to move, not quickly, not with the explosive violence that Kane represented, but with the measured confidence of someone who had earned every step through decades of honest effort and honest mistakes. He walked through the crowd, and people instinctively stepped aside, creating a path that seemed to form naturally before him. There was no pushing, no shoving, no drama, just a quiet parting of the sea of humanity that somehow felt more powerful than any grand entrance could have been. The path that formed seemed almost mystical in its precision, as if the crowd was responding to something deeper than conscious thought. Veterans who had served in combat zones found themselves stepping back with the automatic respect they showed to superior officers. Mothers pulled their children closer, not from fear but from an instinctive desire to let their kids witness something important. Young fighters who had come to see Kane perform suddenly found themselves studying Rocky's movement, trying to understand what it was about this aging man that commanded such automatic deference. As Rocky approached the platform area, Kane's bravado kicked into overdrive, his voice becoming louder and more theatrical, as if volume could compensate for the growing sense that he was losing control of the situation. "Oh, look, the fossil wants to get closer. Maybe he wants to get a better look at what a real champion looks like. Tell me, Rocky, when you look at me, do you see everything you wish you could have been? Do you see the future that passed you by while you were busy being yesterday's news?" His words echoed through the arena, but somehow they seemed to lose their power the closer Rocky got, as if the older man's presence was absorbing their venom and neutralizing their impact. The insults that had seemed so cutting from a distance began to sound hollow and desperate when delivered to someone who refused to be diminished by them, someone whose very existence seemed to prove that worth couldn't be measured in championships or endorsement deals or social media followers. Kane jumped down from his elevated position, landing with the athletic grace that had made him famous, his muscles rippling under his custom-made shirt like a predator preparing to strike. He was taller than Rocky, younger, stronger in every measurable way, his presence commanding and intimidating in the way that had made him millions of dollars and millions of fans. He represented everything that modern combat sports celebrated: youth, aggression, marketability, and an almost supernatural confidence in one's own superiority. But as he stood face to face with Rocky, something strange began to happen. The physical advantages that had always served Kane so well seemed less impressive somehow, less meaningful when confronted with the quiet dignity that Rocky radiated like heat from a banked fire. It was as if the two men existed in different universes, one where strength was measured in pounds of pressure and knockout percentages, and another where strength was measured in character and integrity and the ability to remain yourself no matter what the world threw at you. "You know what, old man?" Kane's voice dropped to a more conversational tone, but one that still carried clearly through his wireless microphone, ensuring that every word would be preserved for posterity and replayed endlessly on social media. "I'm feeling generous tonight. I'm going to give you a chance to save whatever's left of your dignity. Get on your knees, right here, right now, and apologize to everyone in this arena for wasting their time. Apologize for being a fraud, for being a joke, for being everything that's wrong with the sport I've perfected." The demand hung in the air like a toxic cloud, so outrageous and cruel that it seemed to momentarily stun the entire arena into silence. This wasn't trash talk anymore. This was something darker, something that crossed lines that most people instinctively recognized, even if they couldn't articulate exactly what those lines were. The crowd's reaction was immediate and visceral, a wave of boos that seemed to rise from every section of the massive building like a tsunami of disapproval. Even Kane's most dedicated fans seemed shocked by the demand, their cheers dying in their throats as they processed what their hero had just asked for. This wasn't the entertaining arrogance they had come to expect. This was genuine cruelty, the kind of behavior that revealed something ugly about both the person making the demand and the society that had created and celebrated him. Some people began to stand, not in celebration but in protest, their body language making it clear that they wanted no part of what was happening. Others started heading for the exits, unable to watch what was unfolding, their departure a silent but powerful statement about the difference between entertainment and degradation, between competition and humiliation, between strength and sadism. The exodus wasn't massive, but it was noticeable, and each person who left took with them a piece of the energy that had made Kane's performance possible, leaving behind a crowd that was less enthusiastic and more conflicted about what they were witnessing. Rocky stopped walking. For the first time since this encounter began, he was completely still, his entire being focused on this moment with the kind of attention that great fighters bring to the seconds before a knockout punch is thrown or received. The silence stretched out like a taut wire, threatening to snap at any moment under the weight of everything that was being said and everything that was being left unsaid. Kane, interpreting this stillness as submission or fear, pressed his advantage with the desperation of someone who sensed his dominance slipping away. "That's right, you pathetic old son." Rocky's voice was quiet, barely amplified by the sound system, but somehow it carried to every corner of the massive arena with perfect clarity, cutting through Kane's bluster like a knife through paper. It was just one word, but it contained multitudes. Decades of experience, years of wisdom, the accumulated understanding of someone who had seen the best and worst of human nature and had somehow managed to maintain faith in the possibility of redemption. There was no anger in it, no threat, no challenge, just a simple acknowledgement of what Kane truly was underneath all his bluster and bravado. Someone's son, someone's child who had lost his way. Kane's mouth snapped shut as if he had been physically struck, the single word hitting him with more force than any punch he had ever taken in his professional career. The word hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore or dismiss, carrying with it implications and associations that Kane wasn't prepared to confront. In that one syllable, Rocky had stripped away all the posturing and pretense and marketing and manufactured drama to reveal the essential truth that this wasn't a confrontation between legends and has-beens or champions and pretenders, but between a man who had learned how to be strong and a boy who was still trying to figure out what strength meant. Rocky looked up at Kane with eyes that had seen everything the world had to offer. Its beauty and its ugliness, its triumphs and its failures, its heroes and its villains, its moments of grace and its descents into darkness. In those eyes, Kane didn't see fear or submission or any of the reactions he had been hoping to provoke. Instead, he saw something far more unsettling and far more powerful: pity. Not the condescending pity that successful people sometimes show to those less fortunate, but the gentle pity of someone who recognized pain and wanted to help heal it rather than exploit it. "You remind me of someone I used to know," Rocky continued, his voice still soft, but somehow filling the vast space with the kind of presence that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with authenticity. Angry, talented, sure that the whole world was against him. Thought respect was something you took instead of something you earned. Thought being strong meant making other people feel weak. Thought being successful meant making other people feel like failures. The words weren't accusatory or judgmental. They were simply observations, delivered with the patience of someone who had learned these lessons the hard way, who had made these mistakes himself and had somehow found his way to a better understanding. There was no superiority in Rocky's tone, no suggestion that he considered himself better than Kane or anyone else. Instead, there was the gentle authority of someone who had walked this path and could see where it led. Kane tried to respond, tried to summon the rage and arrogance that had always served him so well in moments of confrontation, but found himself strangely speechless. This wasn't going according to any script he understood. The old man was supposed to be intimidated, supposed to cower before Kane's obvious superiority, supposed to provide the kind of easy victory that would reinforce everything Kane believed about himself and his place in the world. Instead, Rocky was treating him like what? Like a child having a tantrum, like someone who deserved understanding rather than fear, like a person who was worth saving rather than destroying. "I ain't gonna fight you, son," Rocky said, and somehow those words hit harder than any physical blow could have, cutting through Kane's defenses with surgical precision. "Not because I'm scared, and not because you're better than me. I ain't gonna fight you because you're hurting, and hurting people hurt people. I've been where you are, standing on top of the world, thinking that made me better than everybody else. It don't." The arena was so quiet you could hear individual conversations from the nosebleed sections, could hear the hum of the air conditioning system, could hear the soft whisper of 25,000 people breathing in unison as they processed what they were witnessing. Kane's entourage looked confused, unsure whether they should be angry or embarrassed or something else entirely. Their champion, their undefeated warrior, their golden goose was being dismantled not with fists, but with words that somehow cut deeper than any physical assault could have managed. The truth of Rocky's words resonated through the building like a bell being struck, creating harmonics that touched something deep in everyone present. People began to see Kane not as an invincible champion, but as what he really was. A young man in pain, someone who had never learned healthy ways to deal with his trauma and his fear, someone who had been told that success would heal his wounds, but had discovered that victory without honor was just another form of emptiness. Kane's hands clenched into fists, the knuckles white with tension, his entire body radiating the kind of barely controlled violence that had made him famous and feared. His entire identity, everything he had built his life around, was being called into question by this old man who should have been easy prey, should have provided the kind of simple validation that Kane's wounded ego desperately needed. "You don't know anything about me," he finally managed to shout, but even his own voice sounded hollow and desperate, lacking the conviction that had always made his threats so effective. "You don't know what I've been through, what I've sacrificed, what I've had to do to get where I am. You don't know about growing up in the projects, about having to fight for every scrap of respect, about watching your mother work herself to death trying to keep food on the table. You don't know about being written off before you even had a chance, about having to prove yourself every single day to people who wanted to see you fail." The words poured out of Kane like water from a broken dam. Years of accumulated pain and rage and frustration finally finding an outlet. For the first time in his professional career, he was being genuine rather than performative, was revealing something real about himself rather than maintaining the carefully crafted persona that had made him millions. The crowd listened in stunned silence as their villain revealed himself to be something far more complex and tragic. A victim who had become a victimizer, a wounded child who had never learned how to heal. "You're right," Rocky nodded, his agreement somehow more devastating than any argument could have been. "I don't know your story, but I know pain when I see it. I know what it looks like when someone's trying so hard to prove they're worth something that they forget they already are." He took a small step forward, not aggressively, but with the gentle approach of someone reaching out to a wounded animal. Someone who understood that healing required patience and kindness rather than force. The gesture was simple but profound, a movement that spoke volumes about the difference between the two men. Where Kane had spent his career trying to dominate space, to claim territory and defend it against all comers, Rocky moved with the confidence of someone who understood that true strength didn't require the conquest of others. His step forward was an invitation rather than an invasion, an offer of connection rather than a threat of violence. "I see you, son," Rocky continued, his voice carrying a warmth that seemed impossible given the circumstances, a gentleness that stood in stark contrast to the cruelty that Kane had been displaying. "I see past all this noise and anger. You got talent, you got heart, but somewhere along the way you started thinking that being strong meant making other people feel small. That ain't strength, that's fear wearing a disguise." The words hit Kane like a series of body shots, each one finding its mark with surgical precision, each one revealing another layer of truth that he had spent years trying to hide from himself and the world. His legs felt suddenly unsteady, not from any physical blow, but from the emotional weight of having his defenses systematically dismantled by someone who seemed to see right through to the core of who he really was underneath all the posturing and performance. The champion, who had never been knocked down in 37 professional fights, found himself swaying as if he had taken a devastating uppercut, his equilibrium destroyed not by physical force, but by the simple application of understanding and compassion. The crowd watched in amazement as their seemingly invincible champion was reduced to his essential components: fear, pain, and a desperate need for validation that no amount of championship belts or endorsement deals could ever truly satisfy. "You want to know what real strength looks like?" Rocky asked, his voice still gentle but now carrying the weight of absolute moral authority. The kind of presence that comes from decades of learning the difference between being tough and being strong, between winning and succeeding, between conquering and achieving. Real strength is helping someone up after you knock them down. Real strength is knowing when not to fight. Real strength is being able to look at yourself in the mirror and see all your flaws and still choose to be better tomorrow than you were today. Each word landed with the precision of a master craftsman, building an argument that was impossible to refute because it was built on truth rather than rhetoric, on experience rather than theory, on wisdom rather than cleverness. Kane found himself nodding almost involuntarily, some part of him recognizing the validity of what Rocky was saying, even as his ego fought against the implications. The transformation happening in front of 25,000 witnesses was visible to everyone present, as clear and undeniable as a physical knockout. Kane's face, usually set in a mask of confident arrogance, began to crumble like a dam giving way under pressure. His eyes, which had always blazed with the fire of conquest and domination, began to fill with something far more human and far more vulnerable: confusion, pain, and the dawning realization that he had been living a lie for so long that he had forgotten what the truth felt like. "I ain't your enemy, Marcus," Rocky said, using Kane's first name for the first time. The simple act of being called by his given name rather than his fighting nickname somehow stripping away another layer of the persona he had spent years building. The use of his real name was like a key turning in a lock, opening doors that Kane had kept sealed for decades, allowing light into spaces that had been dark for so long that he had forgotten they existed. "I'm just an old guy who's made every mistake you're making right now. The only difference is I was lucky enough to have people who cared enough to show me a better way, people who saw past my anger and my fear and my need to prove myself and helped me understand that the strongest thing you can do is admit when you're wrong and ask for help." Kane's hands unclenched slowly, his fingers straightening as if he was releasing something he had been holding onto for far too long. His breathing slowed and deepened, the hyperventilation of rage giving way to something that resembled the normal rhythm of someone who was finally able to relax, finally able to stop fighting battles that didn't need to be fought. For the first time in years, perhaps decades, he wasn't performing for anyone, wasn't maintaining a character or projecting an image or trying to control how others perceived him. The silence in the arena was complete and profound, the kind of quiet that occurs in sacred spaces when something meaningful is happening. 25,000 people sat without moving, without speaking, without even seeming to breathe as they witnessed something that transcended sports, transcended entertainment, transcended everything they thought they had come to see. They were watching a human soul being rebuilt in real time, brick by brick, with nothing but words and understanding and the kind of unconditional acceptance that most people spend their entire lives searching for without ever finding. Kane looked around at the crowd, for perhaps the first time really seeing them, not as an audience for his performance or consumers of his manufactured drama, but as people, individuals with their own struggles and hopes and dreams, fathers and mothers and children who had come seeking something more than just entertainment. His vision seemed to clear, as if a fog that had been clouding his perception for years was finally lifting, allowing him to see the world as it really was, rather than as he had convinced himself it should be. "I don't know how to be anything else," Kane whispered, his words picked up by the sensitive microphone and broadcast to the world, his voice carrying the kind of raw vulnerability that cuts through all pretense and performance to reveal the human being underneath. In that moment of absolute honesty, he was no longer the destroyer, no longer the champion, no longer the carefully crafted persona that had made him millions of dollars and millions of enemies. He was simply Marcus, a scared kid from Chicago who had used his fists to build walls around his heart so high that he had forgotten how to let anyone in. Rocky reached into his jacket pocket with the slow, deliberate movement of someone handling something precious. What he withdrew was small and worn, creased and faded from years of handling, a photograph that had clearly been looked at thousands of times, carried through countless journeys, treasured in ways that championship belts and trophies never could be. He held it out toward Kane, close enough that the champion could see it clearly, the gesture intimate and personal despite being witnessed by 25,000 strangers. "This is my son," Rocky said simply, his voice carrying all the pride and pain and love that those three words could contain. He used to be angry too. Angry at me, angry at the world, angry at himself for not being perfect, for not living up to expectations that probably weren't fair in the first place. Took me too long to realize that his anger wasn't really about me, it was about him not knowing how to handle all the love and fear and hope he was carrying around inside, not knowing how to be vulnerable without feeling weak. Kane looked at the photograph, and for a moment his carefully maintained mask slipped completely away. In that image of a young man with troubled eyes but a gentle smile, he saw something that hit him like a physical blow to the chest. He saw himself, not as he was now, hardened and bitter and afraid, but as he had been before. The anger consumed everything good in him before he had learned to mistake cruelty for strength and isolation for independence. The young man in the photograph looked like someone who might have been Kane's brother or cousin, someone who shared not just physical features, but the unmistakable look of someone carrying burdens too heavy for their age. There was pain in those eyes, yes, but also hope. The kind of hope that Kane had forgotten was possible. The belief that things could get better if you were willing to do the work and accept the help and admit that you didn't have all the answers. What happened to him? Kane asked, his voice barely above a whisper, but somehow audible to the entire arena through his still active microphone. The question carried weight far beyond its simple words. It was really asking about possibility, about redemption, about whether someone who had gone as far down the wrong path as Kane had could ever find their way back to something resembling peace. He learned, Rocky replied, carefully returning the photograph to his pocket with the reverence of someone handling a religious relic. Learned that being vulnerable ain't the same as being weak. Learned that asking for help ain't giving up. It's growing up. Learned that the strongest thing you can do sometimes is admit that you don't have all the answers, that you're scared, that you're hurting, that you need other people to help you figure out how to be the person you want to be. He paused, looking directly into Kane's eyes with the kind of steady gaze that sees past surface appearances to the truth underneath. He learned that being a champion ain't about how many people you can knock down. It's about how many people you can help stand up. It's about using whatever gifts you got, your strength, your platform, your influence, to make the world a little bit better instead of just making yourself feel a little bit more important. The words settled over the arena like snow, quiet and gentle, but transformative in their cumulative effect. People throughout the crowd found themselves thinking about their own relationships, their own mistakes, their own opportunities to choose between building others up or tearing them down. Parents looked at their children with new understanding. Coaches reconsidered their methods. Fans questioned what they were really cheering for when they celebrated one person's dominance over another. Kane's legs buckled slightly, and for a terrifying moment it looked like the champion who had never been knocked down might actually fall. But Rocky was there, his weathered hand reaching out to steady the younger man with a touch that was brief, but contained everything Kane had been missing his entire life: genuine care from someone who expected nothing in return, support offered without conditions or contracts or performance requirements. The contact between them was electric in its simplicity. Rocky's hand on Kane's arm was just flesh touching flesh, but it represented something that Kane had been searching for his entire career without realizing it. Human connection that wasn't based on what he could do for someone else, wasn't dependent on his ability to win fights or generate revenue or maintain his carefully crafted image. It was just one person reaching out to another person in a moment of need, as simple and profound as any gesture in human history. "I don't know how to be anything else," Kane repeated, but this time the words carried a different meaning. They weren't a statement of defeat, but a confession, an admission that he was ready to learn something new, ready to consider the possibility that there might be ways of being strong that he had never explored. Ways of being successful that didn't require the destruction of others. "That's okay, son," Rocky replied, his hand still resting gently on Kane's arm, the contact grounding and reassuring in ways that Kane hadn't experienced since childhood. "Nobody's born knowing how to be their best self. It's something you got to learn, and the learning never stops. The good news is you got time, you got talent, and now you got someone who's willing to help you figure it out if you want." The offer hung in the air between them, simple and honest and free of conditions. Rocky wasn't asking for anything in return, no publicity, no payment, no public acknowledgement of his role in Kane's transformation. He was simply offering what he had always offered to anyone who needed it: guidance, support, and the kind of unconditional acceptance that allows people to become better versions of themselves. Kane looked up at Rocky with eyes that seemed to be seeing clearly for the first time in years, perhaps for the first time in his entire adult life. The arrogance was gone. The manufactured rage was gone. The desperate need to prove his superiority was gone. What remained was something far more powerful and far more real. A young man ready to learn what it truly meant to be strong, ready to discover what kind of champion he could become if he stopped trying to destroy others and started trying to build them up instead. The arena began to stir as people processed what they had witnessed, but the movement was different from the usual restless energy of a crowd waiting for the next entertainment. This was the quiet stirring of people who had seen something meaningful, something that had changed them in ways they were still trying to understand. Conversations began in hushed tones as strangers turned to each other not to discuss what they had seen, but to share what they had felt, what they had recognized in themselves during Kane's transformation. But the story was far from over. As Kane stood there, his entire worldview crumbling and rebuilding itself simultaneously, something remarkable began to happen throughout the massive arena. The transformation that had begun with one man's breakdown was spreading like ripples across still water, touching lives and changing perspectives in ways that would be felt long after the lights dimmed and the crowd went home. In the front row, a businessman who had been cheering loudly for Kane's cruelty found himself thinking about his own son, about the harsh words he had spoken that very morning before leaving for this event. He remembered the look in his boy's eyes when he had criticized his grades, the way his child's shoulders had slumped under the weight of disappointment that probably said more about the father's own insecurities than about any real failure on the son's part. He pulled out his phone, not to record what was happening, but to text an apology, to try to undo some of the damage he had done with his own need to be right rather than kind. 3 sections over, a teenager who had idolized Kane's aggressive dominance suddenly felt ashamed of the way he had been treating his classmates, the way he had used his size and athletic ability to make smaller kids feel insignificant and afraid. He thought about Tommy Morrison, the quiet kid with thick glasses who sat alone at lunch every day, and realized that his own fear of being seen as weak had led him to make someone else feel exactly the way he was most afraid of feeling himself. Throughout the arena, similar reckonings were taking place as people confronted the uncomfortable truth that they had been complicit in celebrating something ugly, something that diminished everyone involved. The ripple effect spread through the crowd like a wave, touching celebrities in the VIP section who began to question their own use of social media to tear others down, reaching athletes who realized they had been confusing intimidation with inspiration, affecting parents who understood suddenly that their children were watching and learning from every example they set. Kane's manager, Vincent Torino, stood frozen at the edge of the platform, his entire business model crumbling before his eyes. For 15 years, he had made millions by creating and managing villains, by finding young fighters with talent and anger and molding them into personas that people would pay to see destroyed. He had convinced himself that he was just giving the public what they wanted, that he was simply a businessman operating in a marketplace of manufactured emotions and artificial conflicts. But watching his golden goose stripped down to his essential humanity, seeing the genuine peace that was beginning to settle over Kane's features like sunlight after a storm, Vinny realized that he had been part of the problem. He had taken young men who were already hurting and had taught them to weaponize their pain, to transform their trauma into entertainment for others. He had built an empire on human suffering, and the success of that empire had blinded him to its true cost. The money, the endorsements, the carefully crafted storylines, the manufactured feuds, all of it suddenly felt hollow and meaningless when confronted with the reality of what genuine strength looked like. Vinny found himself thinking about his own children, wondering what they thought of their father's career, whether they were proud of what he did for a living or secretly ashamed of the way he made his money. Rocky noticed the manager's distress and addressed him directly, though his words were meant for everyone listening, for everyone who had ever made a living by exploiting others or had simply stood by while exploitation happened in their name. "It ain't too late for any of us to choose different," he said, his voice carrying the weight of lived experience, the authority of someone who had made his own share of mistakes and had learned from them. "I spent years thinking that being tough meant being hard, that caring about people was weakness, that showing emotion was something only losers did. Nearly lost everything that mattered before I figured out that the strongest people I ever knew were the ones who weren't afraid to be gentle, who could be vulnerable without being weak, who could love without being ashamed of it." Kane wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, a gesture so simple and human that it seemed to complete his transformation from untouchable champion to approachable human being. "I don't even remember when it started," he said, speaking not just to Rocky, but to everyone who was listening, to everyone who had ever made the same mistakes he had made. The anger, the need to hurt people before they could hurt me. Somewhere along the way, I convinced myself that if I could make everyone fear me, I'd never have to be afraid again. His voice grew stronger as he continued, not with the artificial bravado that had characterized his public persona, but with the genuine strength that comes from telling the truth about yourself, from admitting your mistakes and committing to doing better. But the fear never went away. It just got bigger and meaner and hungrier until it was eating up everything good in my life. I thought I was protecting myself, but I was really just building a prison and calling it a castle. Rocky nodded with the understanding of someone who had walked the same path, who had made the same discoveries about the difference between being feared and being respected, between being isolated and being independent, between being tough and being strong. "Fear's like darkness, son," he replied, his voice carrying the warmth of hard-won wisdom. "The harder you fight against it, the bigger it gets, the more power you give it over your life. But you shine a little light on it, treat it like what it really is, just the absence of something better, and it don't have no power over you anymore." The metaphor resonated through the arena like a bell being struck, creating harmonics that touched something deep in everyone present. People began to understand that they were witnessing more than just one man's transformation. They were seeing a demonstration of principles that could change anyone's life, that could transform any relationship, that could heal wounds they hadn't even realized they were carrying. Kane looked around at the crowd again, but this time he was really seeing them, not as an audience for his performance or consumers of his manufactured drama, but as people, individuals with their own struggles and hopes and dreams. Families who had spent their hard-earned money to come here tonight expecting entertainment, but finding something far more valuable instead. "I owe all of you an apology," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word, not with artificial volume, but with the genuine power that comes from accepting responsibility, not just for tonight, but for years of setting the worst possible example. For teaching kids that might makes right, that being strong means making other people feel weak, that success means stepping on everyone who gets in your way. For taking the gifts I was given, the strength, the platform, the ability to influence people, and using them to spread anger instead of hope, division instead of unity, fear instead of inspiration. A woman in the upper deck stood up and began to clap. But it wasn't the wild, frenzied applause that typically followed a knockout or a spectacular finish. This was something different, the slow, measured clapping that acknowledges something profound and meaningful, the kind of recognition that is given not to entertainment, but to truth, not to performance, but to genuine human courage. Others joined her gradually, and soon the entire arena was on its feet, but this wasn't celebration in any traditional sense. It was recognition, recognition of the courage it takes to admit you're wrong, recognition of the strength required to ask for help, recognition of the kind of victory that leaves everyone involved better than they were before. The applause built slowly and organically, not because people were being encouraged to cheer, but because they genuinely wanted to acknowledge what they had witnessed. Rocky gestured for quiet, and the crowd immediately responded, settling back into their seats with the kind of respectful attention that great teachers and great leaders command not through demand, but through earned authority. In that moment, he commanded more genuine respect and attention than Kane ever had with all his bluster and threats, all his manufactured controversy and carefully orchestrated drama. "This young man here just did something most people ain't brave enough to do their whole lives," Rocky announced, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent arena, reaching every corner of the massive building with the kind of presence that has nothing to do with technology and everything to do with authenticity. He looked at himself honest, didn't like what he saw, and decided to be better. That takes more courage than stepping into any ring or octagon ever could. The words settled over the crowd like a benediction, acknowledging not just Kane's transformation, but the universal human struggle to become better versions of ourselves, to overcome our own worst impulses and choose growth over comfort, change over stagnation, hope over fear. People throughout the arena found themselves thinking about their own lives, their own opportunities to make different choices, their own moments when they had chosen the easy path of anger and division over the harder path of understanding and connection. Kane straightened his shoulders, but it wasn't the manufactured confidence of his persona returning. It was something entirely different, something genuine and sustainable. It was the kind of dignity that comes from facing your demons and choosing growth over pride, from accepting help instead of insisting on handling everything alone, from understanding that true strength comes not from never falling, but from getting back up every time you do fall. "I want to do something I've never done before," Kane said, looking directly at Rocky with eyes that were clear and honest and unafraid, for perhaps the first time in his adult life. "I want to ask for help. I want to learn how to be the kind of person my mother raised me to be before I forgot who that was, before I let the world convince me that being good meant being weak." The request hung in the air like a prayer, vulnerable and honest and completely without artifice or calculation. It was the kind of moment that changes everything, not just for the person making the request, but for everyone who witnesses it, everyone who sees that it's possible to choose differently, no matter how far down the wrong path you've gone. Rocky's response was immediate and warm, carrying all the love and acceptance that Kane had been searching for his entire life without realizing it. "Son, it would be my honor to help you figure that out. But the first thing you got to understand is that you don't need me to fix you, because you ain't broken. You just got a little lost along the way. And sometimes we all need someone to remind us which direction is home." As the two men stood together on the arena floor, the contrast between them was still striking, but no longer divisive or competitive. Rocky's grey hair and lined face spoke of decades of experience, of battles fought both in the ring and in life, of wisdom earned through victory and defeat alike. Kane's youth and physical perfection now seemed less like advantages to be leveraged and more like potential waiting to be properly directed towards something meaningful and lasting. Together, they represented something powerful and hopeful, the possibility of redemption, the reality that change is always possible no matter how old you are or how far you've strayed from your best self. The truth that real strength comes from lifting others up rather than tearing them down. They embodied the idea that mentorship and guidance can flow in both directions, that everyone has something to learn and something to teach. The media representatives, who had come expecting a typical sports spectacle, found themselves documenting something far more significant and lasting. This wasn't just sports news. This was a story about the human capacity for growth and change, about the power of compassion to transform even the most hardened hearts, about the courage required to admit that the path you've been walking isn't the one that leads where you actually want to go. Reporters who had built their careers on controversy and conflict struggled to find the right words to describe what they had witnessed. Their usual vocabulary of winners and losers, heroes and villains seemed inadequate to capture the complexity and beauty of what had unfolded. Some put away their cameras and notebooks, understanding instinctively that there were moments too sacred to commodify, experiences too meaningful to reduce to sound bites and headlines. Kane's entourage, the collection of hangers-on and enablers who had fed off his anger and aggression for years, began to disperse like shadows when the sun comes up. Some looked ashamed, finally recognizing their role in perpetuating something destructive. Others seemed confused, unable to process a version of success that wasn't built on dominance and intimidation. But most simply drifted away as they realized their services were no longer needed. That the man standing in the center of the arena didn't need people to tell him how great he was. He needed people who would help him become genuinely worthy of respect, rather than simply demanding it through fear. The transformation was complete, but also just beginning. Kane would still be the UFC heavyweight champion. That hadn't changed. But everything else about who he was and how he chose to use his platform would be different. The belt around his waist would still be gold, but it would represent something entirely new. Not conquest, but responsibility. Not dominance, but service. Not the ability to destroy, but the commitment to build. As the evening wound down and the crowd began to file out of the arena, the conversations continued in parking lots and restaurants, in cars and on buses and trains heading home. Parents used the encounter as a teaching moment with their children, explaining the difference between the kind of strength that builds and the kind that destroys. Coaches throughout the city and beyond began reconsidering their training methods, wondering if they had been teaching their athletes to be warriors or just more sophisticated bullies. Young fighters who had been following Kane's career as a roadmap for their own success found themselves questioning everything they thought they knew about what it meant to be a champion. They began to understand that there was a difference between being feared and being respected, between winning at any cost and succeeding in ways that made you proud to look in the mirror. Rocky and Kane walked together toward the arena exit, their conversation continuing in quieter tones as the crowd thinned around them. They made plans to meet the following week, not for training in the traditional sense, but for the more important work of rebuilding a life on a foundation of purpose rather than rage. Kane had questions about forgiveness, about making amends, about how to use his platform to heal rather than harm. Rocky had answers, or at least the wisdom to help Kane find his own answers. They talked about practical things too, how Kane could begin repairing relationships he had damaged, how he could restructure his training camp to focus on building character as well as fighting skills, how he could use his social media presence to inspire rather than intimidate. But mostly they talked about the internal work that would be required, the daily choice to be better rather than just stronger, to be genuinely confident rather than artificially superior. The transformation that had begun in front of 25,000 witnesses would continue in private, in the daily choices that define who we really are when nobody is watching. It would happen in Kane's interactions with his training partners, in his responses to criticism and setbacks, in his decision to treat service staff and reporters and fans with the same respect he demanded for himself. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be quick, but it would be real in a way that Kane's previous success never had been. There would be setbacks and moments of doubt, times when the old patterns of anger and intimidation would seem easier than the new path of vulnerability and growth. But he would have Rocky to call, and more importantly, he would have a new understanding of what strength really meant. As they reached the arena exit, Kane turned back for one last look at the space where his old life had ended and his new one had begun. The building was nearly empty now, just maintenance crews beginning their work and a few stragglers still processing what they had witnessed. "Thank you," Kane said simply, the words carrying the weight of genuine gratitude rather than obligation or politeness, for seeing something in me that I had forgotten was there, for not giving up on me when I had given up on myself, for showing me that there was another way to be strong, another way to be successful, another way to live. Rocky smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features into something warm and paternal and infinitely patient. "Son, I didn't see nothing that wasn't already there. Sometimes we just need someone to remind us who we really are underneath all the noise and confusion and fear. That's what real champions do for each other. They help each other remember what's possible." The arena lights dimmed as the last of the crowd departed, but the impact of what had occurred would continue to ripple outward like waves from a stone thrown into still water. Videos of the encounter would be shared millions of times on social media, but more importantly, the principles demonstrated would be lived out in countless small ways by people who had witnessed something profound and decided to apply it to their own lives. Children who had seen Kane's transformation would remember it years later when they faced their own moments of choice between cruelty and kindness. Adults who had recognized themselves in Kane's anger would begin their own journeys toward healing. The arena would host many more events, but none would be remembered as clearly or talked about as often as the night when one man's vulnerability had reminded everyone present that it's never too late to choose who you want to be. This was the kind of victory that lasted, the kind of strength that inspired rather than intimidated, the kind of story that reminded everyone who heard it that the most important battles we fight are not against other people, but against our own worst impulses, our own fears, our own resistance to becoming the people we know we could be if we just had the courage to try. CTA Final. If this story touched something deep inside you, drop a comment about a time when someone showed you real strength through kindness. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe, because stories like this are what make us all better. Remember, it's never too late to choose who you want to be. The choice is always yours.